Cool. Is everybody ready to get going then? Sweet. Cool. Okay, so this talk's called Test-Driven Laravel. My name's Adam Wathan. I'm a developer at a company called Titan Co. We're a web consultancy based out of Chicago with a fully remote team that does a lot of work with Laravel, building custom software applications for all sorts of clients, startups, enterprise customers alike. I'm also the host of a podcast called Full Stack Radio. Does anybody happen to have listened to the podcast? A few people? Awesome. If anybody wants stickers, come find me after the talk. I have lots of stuff to give away. So, I want to start this presentation by asking you guys a question. Does anybody know who this is? Someone knows, come on. No. So this is Ken Beck, but usually I refer to him as God. And these are two of his disciples, Uncle Bob and Martin Fowler. And together these guys actually authored the 7 books of the Holy Bible of Programming. So that book on the end there is Test-Driven Development, by example, by Kent Beck. And that's kind of where he introduced this idea of test-driven development, or at least kind of like popularized it. Has anybody ever done any TDD before or familiar with what TDD is? Cool, a few people. So at its most basic, test-driven development is about this feedback loop, the TDD loop, where you start by writing a failing test, and then you do whatever you need to do to make that test pass, and then you refactor whatever code you wrote until you're happy with kind of the design that you've ended up with, and then move on to writing the next failing test, and you just implement features one by one through this flow. And if you were to look at like a simple example of this that you might see when someone's first trying to learn what TDD is all about, you'd probably see something like this, where we're building like a calculator, right? And we want to test the calculator. So first we write a test for the calculator's add function. We create a new calculator. We say that when we add 5 and 7, we should get 12. And we write this test first before we've written any code, run the test, and you'll get a failure or something like this. You know, there's no calculator class. So following the guidance of the tests, you'd implement the calculator class or create the calculator class, but leave it empty because the tests haven't told you to do anything besides that yet. Run the tests again, you'll see an error like this. There's no add method. So we add an add method with the correct signature, but we don't make it do anything yet because the tests haven't told us that it needs to. Run the test again, we get an error saying that we expected 12, but got null. So now you finally have to go and actually implement the functionality for the calculator. So obviously adding 2 numbers together is really simple. This is a really simple thing to build because you can do this in isolation, right? The calculator class has no dependencies. It's not talking to the database. It's not talking to the network. It doesn't have to do anything crazy. Really simple to test. So you might be trying to learn TDD and see an example like that and think, oh yeah, this makes perfect sense. Like I totally understand this. I could go off and use this on my projects and I'm excited to get started with it. But then you sit down to actually apply this to a real world application and all of a sudden there's all these, complicated pieces to it, and you're trying to figure out, well, how am I supposed to TDD something that talks to the database or something that responds to an HTTP request? And you realize that the simple examples that people teach this stuff with are not always that helpful when you're trying to apply this stuff in the real world. So my goal for this talk today is to walk through how I would use TDD to drive out a brand new Laravel application from scratch with 0 code existing at the beginning, and kind of show you guys how you could get the ball rolling so that you have a little bit of momentum going forward so that you can use the same sort of strategy to continue writing tests, drive out unit tests, and not end up with code that doesn't have any test coverage. I know for me, when I was getting into this stuff, some of the hardest pieces, TDD seemed kind of easy once I had like some scaffolding set up and some things in place. If I was just driving out some new small piece of functionality, it was easy to TDD that in the context of an existing application. But when it came to just like, what's the very first test that I have to write for something, and I have no idea how am I supposed to have this drive out my database configuration or create routes or any of that stuff, it got to be a bit overwhelming and a little intimidating. And I think that's a big reason why a lot of people don't end up actually doing this stuff and kind of get blocked. So we're going to do this using an example application called Tweeter, which is very similar to an app that you might have heard of in the past. It's slightly better because the tweets go to 141. It's like the Spinal Tap of Twitter clones. I drew that bird. I think it's pretty good. So you have this app that you want to build, this Twitter clone. The first question that you probably ask yourself is something like this. What should my very first test be? How am I supposed to get started here? There's a lot of different features, right? People need to be able to post tweets. They need to follow people. There's timelines. There's account registration. There's resetting passwords, all sorts of stuff. And how do you choose what the first thing that you're supposed to drive out through a test is? And this ties into a lot of ideas that are bigger than TDD itself. Things like just agile development in general and agile development practices and iterative development and being able to deliver applications in small slices of incremental functionality. So you need to be able to choose the right thing to start with that's going to help you kind of make the most progress up front. So if we kind of make a little to-do list of some of the things that this app needs to do, we need to be able to do things like create an account, post a tweet, view someone else's tweets on their profile, follow another user, and then aggregate all these tweets together in a timeline, right? So looking at this, how do you figure out what's the best thing to start with? There's a really good book by Nat Price and Steve Freeman called Growing Object-Oriented Software Guided by Tests, where they talk about using TDD to create applications from scratch. And they have, when they talk about the very first test that they want to write and the goal of this first test, they talk about this idea of a walking skeleton. And for them, a walking skeleton means stringing together a version of the application that's working in the sense that all the pieces that need to work together are working together. This adapter's been giving me a little trouble. Hopefully it works okay. So being able to kind of plug in all the pieces so that you can stand something up that kind of proves everything's connected and working together. And this is kind of a big step, right? You need to have this working before you can dive into actually building any functionality. And you want to get to this step as early as possible and as fast as possible. So you have to pick the right tiny slice of functionality that's going to start at the UI, at the end user's perspective, cut through as much of the application as possible and come back and prove that if this test is passing, that you kind of have some structure in place such that you can keep writing new tests and delivering new features on top of it. And that'll kind of help you get the ball rolling and get started. So keeping this idea of a walking skeleton in mind when we're looking at this list of to-dos and we want to figure out, well, what's the thing that we should start with? Maybe we can use that to help us figure out what the best place to start is. So creating an account, let's kind of measure that against this idea of a walking skeleton. What does that touch? Well, creating an account is going to involve some sort of registration form someone's going to have to fill out. It's going to create a user in the database with a password and stuff like that. Maybe it fires a confirmation email. The thing I don't like about create account as a first feature to implement is that it kind of sidesteps what the app is all about, which is tweets. And the business value of the application is allowing people to post tweets and view other people's tweets and stuff like that. So you're sort of dancing around the main focus of the app by trying to implement all these tangential things. So for me, I would cross that one off the list as a starting point, purely for that reason. I want to deliver something as early as possible that's focused on what the actual application is about. So keeping that in mind, posting a tweet seems like a reasonable candidate for something to start with. It's about the kind of core focus of the app, right, which is this tweeting stuff. But is there any complexity in here that's going to slow us down from getting this full slice kind of built out? The piece that I can think of that adds a little bit of complexity that we might be able to avoid with a different feature is the whole authentication sort of side of things. So to post a tweet, people need to have an account. They need to be authenticated against that account before they can create the tweet. And to verify that the tweet's there, you need to be able to see in the UI that the tweet's there. That's a lot of things that you have to implement at once. So I'm going to cross that one off for now in case there's a better option. Something a little simpler where you have to do a little bit less but still kind of cuts through the whole application in the same way. So viewing someone's tweets. So this one's more interesting because this doesn't involve any authentication, right? You just need to be able to go to someone's profile page, see a list of things that they've tweeted. You don't actually have to create any tweets through the UI to see the tweets that come out, but it's still going to touch all the layers. It's still going to touch the UI layer, the database, any business logic, all that stuff. So for me, I think this is a reasonable place to start. There's probably other places that are equally as valid to start with, but this seems like a reasonable one to start with to me. So why don't we start with that one? So the way that you need to build this stuff when you're trying to TDD a whole application is a little bit more complicated than that simple TDD feedback loop that we talked about at the beginning. I like to take an approach that's referred to as outside-in TDD or acceptance test-driven development a lot of the time. And that looks a little bit more like this. So, You start by writing a failing acceptance test, which is a test written from the end user's point of view that describes some feature or behavior that the system needs to have. You drop down into trying to make that pass, which may or may not involve jumping into an inner TDD loop of driving out unit test-driven components and working on those until all those work, and until eventually the sum of those makes the acceptance test pass. And then you can do any high-level refactoring if you need to, you may not, and you move on to the next failing acceptance test. So this seems like a lot to kind of just imagine in your head abstractly, so I think the best way to go through this stuff is to just like work through an actual example of building out this feature in Laravel and see what we can learn as we do it. So I have a brand new fresh install of a Laravel application here. And the first thing that we want to do is kind of create this first test case, right, which is like viewing someone else's tweets. So Laravel ships with this example test class. I've stripped out the body of it because we're going to use this as a skeleton for the test that we're going to write. The first thing I would do is probably move this into a new folder. So if we move this into like a features folder in our tests folder, that seems like a reasonable place to keep these sort of high-level acceptance tests to me. We'll rename it to something like view users tweets test. Can everyone see all this stuff okay? I guess that's kind of small at the bottom, but I'll blow up the actual code a bit at least anyways. So if we rename the actual test class to be view users tweets test, and we run it to kind of make sure that everything's not busted. It passes because we're not doing anything in it, but at least we kind of got everything hooked up properly. So we want to test that we can view a list of someone's tweets, right? So test viewing another user's tweets. So let's kind of sketch out what this is going to involve. Well, we're going to need to have a user in the system. That user is going to need to have some tweets, right? We're going to want to go to that person's profile page and see the tweets we created. So looking at this, like how can we do this in the simplest way possible? One thing that I see here that I think we can simplify slightly is this idea of tweets, like plural. We only really need to create one tweet to kind of get this end-to-end slice working, and it's slightly simpler than dealing with creating multiple. So let's just do like creating a tweet and seeing the tweet that we created. And then how can we actually go about implementing this starting from the first step and create like these actual setup and assertion lines in our test? So creating a user, well, there's multiple ways that we could create a user, right? There's two kind of main forks in the road here. The first way is that we could create the user through the UI. We could go to the registration page, fill out the registration form, sign the user up, and end up with the user in the database at the end of the day. The second thing that we can do is create the user directly in the test and just create the model and save the model to the database. That's a pattern that they refer to in the RSpec book, which is a book written about the Ruby testing framework, as direct model access. And they say it's a good option for this sort of acceptance test where we're going to cover this registration flow from a different test at some point in our application anyways. And by allowing us to create these models directly, it lets us move to the pieces that this test is more interested in quicker. So I think just creating the user directly in the test seems like a better approach to me in this case. And now, even there though, there's multiple ways we could do that, right? So we could just say user equals, user create, and then pass in like whatever relevant data that we need to. But Laravel, this is brutal. Hopefully this improves. Sorry. So Laravel 5 or 5.1 shipped with a feature called model factories that lets you kind of define like a skeleton for the models that you want to create in your database. It gives you a little bit, removes a little bit of duplication in your setup, where a lot of the time you might want to create a model where only a specific field is relevant to the test, and you don't want to have to worry about specifying the other default fields. So we'll dive into that a little bit more depth when we actually get into implementing the factory, but just trust me for now that creating the user through the factory is a better way to go. So if we create a user from the user factory, and we're going to give them a username because we need to go to that person's profile page, right? And the profile page will probably just be that person's username in the URL. So maybe we create a user with a username of John Doe. We need to create a tweet, so we can kind of do that the same way. So we'll create a tweet, and what can a tweet have? I guess we want to check that we saw the tweet, so the tweet probably needs like a body. So maybe the body of the tweet can be my first tweet. My first tweet. And we don't want to create that tweet because we got to save it to that user. So we got to add that tweet to the user now. So how would we do that in our setup? If you know anything about Eloquent, we can use the relationship to save the instance this way. So this seems like a reasonable approach to me. Something that I'd like to touch on is we're sort of writing code here, but we haven't like tested it or anything, right? And we don't, what we're doing here is what's referred to as programming by wishful thinking. So we're kind of like writing code that doesn't actually exist yet, that we hope will eventually exist. And we'll use the errors from the tests to kind of drive out implementing, first of all, these setup definitions, and then the actual assertions and stuff that we walk through as well. So we created the tweet for the user. So the next thing we need to do is go to that person's profile page. So I believe it was Laravel 5.1 shipped with some really helpful acceptance testing helpers for this sort of thing. They make it really easy to test like an HTTP endpoint and inspect the response. So we can do something as simple as this, just this visit, and then the URL that we want to visit. So in this case, John Doe's profile. And this is provided to us through this base test case class that we're extending that Laravel provides with this helpful functionality. And then to see the tweet that we created is just as simple. So we can just say this see, and then put the text that we're expecting to see there. So my first tweet. And this is actually like our whole acceptance test. This covers everything that we needed to cover. And you'll see as we walk through this, this is going to force us to drive out a lot of functionality in the application. So first step is to run this test and see what it complains about. So unable to locate factory with name default user. So what this is saying is that it can't find a factory definition for this factory model that we want to spit out. And there actually is a factory there. If you go into the database folder, factories, there's this model factory class. Laravel provides one for the user model out of the box because Laravel ships with a user model out of the box that's configured with some defaults that are useful for most applications. I'm going to rip most of this stuff out and throw it away so we can start with a little bit of a cleaner slate. But the main thing that it's complaining about here is that it's a different namespace. So our actual user class is namespaced. So I'll import that namespace here. And if we go back to the test and import the user, so it's actually using app user like it's using in the factory, hopefully we'll get a different error. So it's complaining about the database now. It's complaining that it can't get access to the database running at localhost using the homestead username to save this record. One thing that we should do too is in this factory, since a user is going to have a username, we can define that here, give it a default username. Faker is a PHP library for generating fake data. Laravel injects an instance of this into all your model factory stuff to make it easy to add just kind of fake default data to your models. So Faker actually has a username generator provided out of the box that we can use that'll give us like a fake-ish username. So again, we'll go back to that test failure. So it's complaining that we can't get access to that database. So this is going to force us to configure our test database to get past this stage in the TDD process. So when I'm writing acceptance tests like this, I like to use an in-memory SQLite database if possible, if I'm not using any like MySQL or Postgres specific features that SQLite doesn't support. Because SQLite is really light and being able to run it in memory is nice and fast. And it gives you this easy throwaway disposable database. So it's kind of a nice environment database-wise to do testing in. So how can we get past this error of not being able to access the database? Well, if we look in our config database folder or file, you can see we're defaulting to the MySQL database, but we want to switch to SQLite. So we're going to have to set an environment variable for our DB connection. And we're going to want to change this database to in-memory. So to be able to do that, we need to switch this out so that it's looking in the environment for variables first. And we'll get it to use DB database. And if that's not there, then defaults to this SQLite file-based database. So how do we set this up with PHP unit so that it's actually using this database instead of the default MySQL one? So if you go to the phpunit.xml file that Laravel ships with, you can see at the bottom, there's a bunch of environment variables set up for you already. So we can actually just add the database ones here. So if we say DB connection is going to be SQLite, and the DB database is going to be memory with colons on either side. This is like SQLite's specific syntax for telling it to create a new database in RAM instead of saving it to the disk. This, with any luck, should get us past that test failure and on to the next one. So now we get an error, no such table users. So we have a database now, but we don't have a users table. So Laravel does ship with a users table migration out of the box. The problem is it's not running. So how can we make that migration run at the beginning of all of our tests? If you look at the top of this test case here, when Laravel generates a new test for you, it imports this database migrations trait, which we can use to migrate the database at the beginning of the test. And it's literally as easy as just typing use database migrations. And now our database migrations are going to run at the beginning of every test case and roll back at the end of every test case. And since we're using a SQLite in-memory database, this is really, really fast compared to doing it with a different database. So if we run this now, we'll hopefully get a different error. Something that's useful to think about when you're doing this TDD stuff, it can be really helpful to think about like predicting what the next error is going to be. It kind of gives you some confidence that you're understanding the way the system works and like where you're actually headed. So I always like to try and predict what the error is going to be. In this case, I think the error is going to be something to do with there not being a username column in that users table since we haven't set that up in the migration. And if that's not the error, then there's going to be something else that we have to fix. So that's kind of what I'm doing in my head when I'm working through this stuff. So if we run this test, we do get that error that I was expecting. The users table has no username column. So if we open up the users migration that's provided by Laravel, I ripped out the stuff that it provides by default because we kind of want to do this from a clean slate. So we're going to add a string column, if I could type, called username. And if we run the test again, hopefully we're on to the next error. So now it's complaining that it's unable to locate factory for the tweets. So that's pretty sweet because that means that this first step is working completely now. So we're making pretty good progress. And we've actually created a lot of, set up a lot of the configuration stuff and bootstrapping and stuff in the application as we've been going. And all this has been driven by the test so far, which has been pretty cool. So there's no tweet factory. So let's create a factory for the tweet. So we create a factory for the tweet class. The tweet has a body. We can just use Faker's sentence generator to do this. That should work okay. And if we run this again, with any luck, we will get a different error. So now it's complaining that there is no tweet class. So it's trying to make a tweet class for us, but we don't have one. So we can generate a new model on the command line with PHP artisan make model tweet. And this gives us a tweet now. So we have an empty tweet class that's an eloquent model, so it's tied to the database. If we run this again, I think this is going to fail, but it's going to fail because of a namespace import issue. So hopefully that's true. Class tweet not found still. Great. So if we import the tweet, so we're using app tweet since that's the namespace it generates it under, and we do the same thing in the factory. Now when we run this again, hopefully we get a different error. Call the undefined method illuminate database query builder tweets. This can be a little bit confusing if you're not familiar with like the internals of Laravel, but basically what it's complaining is about is when we call this tweets method on user, since user is an eloquent model, Laravel tries it looks in a couple places for that method before eventually failing. So first it checks on the actual user class itself. If it's not there, it drops down to the query builder. So that's why it's complaining that it can't find it on the query builder. So if we go to our user model, we can make that tweets method exist. So tweets is just a method that takes no parameters. And this is setting up a has many relationship to our tweets. And that's as simple as that to get that going. And now with any luck, we'll get a different error. I'm expecting this to be about there being no tweets table. General error 1, no such table tweets. Cool, exactly what we're expecting. So we need to generate a migration for the tweets table so we can drive this out a little bit further. So if we make a migration called create tweets table, and we'll tell it to create a table called tweets so it can scaffold it out a little bit more for us and check that out. We have an essentially empty migration for the tweets table. So we'll just run the test again. We have no reason to do anything else yet. We'll wait for another error. And this, I think, is going to be something to do with there being no body column on the tweets table. So no body column, just like we were expecting. So we can update our migration to add a body column. So it's going to have a string column for body. Hey.
You want to set the length to 141 characters on that?
I was thinking about doing that because it'd be kind of funny, but there's no test proving that we're going to do that yet. So that would probably get driven out with a different feature, but I appreciate the sentiment. So if we run this test again, we get a complaint that there's no user ID column on the tweets table. It's expecting there to be a user ID column because we've set up that has many relationship between the user and the tweets. So we can add that column. And it should be unsigned since it's a foreign key. Run that again, and hopefully we get a different error. This big messy error is usually about a 404. Yeah, so this is great. So now it's saying that a request to that John Doe endpoint failed because there's no endpoint. So we've made it past all this setup stuff, and all that stuff's working, but now it's complaining that there's no route. Okay, so the next logical step is to create a route. So if we go to our routes file, we'll set up a get route, pointing at someone's username. And again, this whole programming by wishful thinking idea, we could just create a closure here and start like returning hard-coded values, but that's not really going to help us make progress. Instead, I just like to think to myself, well, wouldn't it be nice if we had a user's controller that had a show action? Let's just pretend it exists and then run the tests and see what happens. Maybe it does exist. I don't know. We're letting the tests tell us like what the problems are, right? So if we run the test again, we're going to get an error probably about there not being a controller somewhere in here. 500 class user controller does not exist. Okay. Well, I'll make a user controller then if that's what you want. Tests. So we'll make a controller called users controller. We'll make it plain so it doesn't generate any extra methods for us. Run the test again. Probably it's going to complain that there's no show action. 500 method show does not exist. Okay, fair enough. Open the users controller. Create a show method. It takes, whoa, it's freaking out. I think it's going to show up. Yep. Oh. Sorry about this. I'm trying to be really gentle with my typing so to not move things. Should come back any second now. Okay, so we have a show action in the controller now. If we run the test, we should get another error. So now we're getting an error that the response is coming back with an empty string and it can't find this text that we were expecting to find in there. So we've got past this visit step and now we're in this see assertion and we're not seeing the tweet that we created there. So programming by wishful thinking, again, well, that's because it's not returning the view that contains all that data, right? So of course we should just return that view. So I like to name my views such that they match the controller and action name most of the time. It's a helpful convention, makes things easy to find. So obviously we're going to return the user show view here, and that should pass the test in our naive world where we're just letting the test tell us what to do. Now we should get a more helpful error. So now we're saying that there's no users show view. Okay, fair enough. Can't expect everything to always work out of the box. So we create a users folder in our views folder, create a show.blade.php, and just leave that empty. Run the tests again. Now we get back to that same error that we had, except now this time that empty string is coming from the view. So one thing that we could do here, right, is just slime this test and just return my first tweet here. And if we run this, this is actually going to pass, and we could pretend that we're done. But that's obviously not actually driving out the actual functionality that you want. You could write another acceptance test that's checking for a different tweet, and that would, of course, cause this test to fail because we're returning hard-coded data. But again, following the kind of like programming by wishful thinking attitude, I think a better approach to this is to just kind of write what we want the template to have and see what happens. So maybe we want to return like the tweets in like an unordered list or something. Well, we're going to loop over the user that is available in the view, of course, because we're expecting that there's a user in this view somewhere. We'll get all their tweets, and then we'll just spit out the body of each tweet in a list item. So if we run this test now, what happens? Big dirty stack trace. Somewhere in here there'll be a useful error. It is complaining that there's no user variable defined in the template. Okay, so if we go back to the controller, we got to pass a user in, right? Okay, let's just pass in the user that we think we have, even though we don't. So we pass in a user, run the tests again. Now we should get an error that there's an undefined user method in the controller instead of in the view this time. Okay, cool. So we have to figure out where's this user going to come from, right? The user that matches the username in the controller. And again, there's kind of two approaches that we could take here. The first approach would just be to write the exact code that's going to return that user here, right? So we could say user equals user where username is the username first, because we know that this is what's going to make it pass. And this will probably pass. No? Okay, no user. Import that, and now I think it'll pass. Yeah, so we could do that. But this doesn't really help us make that much meaningful progress like with our design. If we're using TDD as like a way to tease out the design of our application and think about how we want our application to actually be structured, I think a better approach is to fall back again to the whole programming by wishful thinking mentality. And instead of just driving at the implementation here, just think, well, okay, well, where do we get the user from? Well, obviously we just ask the user class to find the user by username. And we expect that to work and run the tests. And it fails because there is no find user by username method on the query builder. It falls through to that for the same reasons that we kind of talked about before. And now we have a decision to make here again. So we could just drive out this implementation using the acceptance test as a driver for it. Or we could kind of do what we were talking about here, where the acceptance test forces us to drive out smaller level component unit tests on the inside. And we haven't actually done any of that yet, so this seems like a good opportunity to do some of that inner TDD loop. So what I would do here is I would create another test. In this case, we're going to make a test for the user. So we'll call it user test. Just leave it out here for now. And what does this need to do? So I'm thinking we're going to have like a created user, which we use the factory again, to create a user with a specific username. Maybe we'll do Jane Doe this time. And then we're going to find a user from the database. So we'll do like found user is user, find by username, Jane Doe. No $ there, that won't compile. And then we can have a couple assertions here. So maybe we'll check that they have the same ID. So maybe the created user ID is the same as the found user ID. And maybe we'll also check that the user that comes back has the username that we were looking for. So pausing quickly for a second here, if you were to browse around on the internet, you might find some people telling you things like this. You should never hit the database in your test. That's bad design, right? Because that's what we're doing here, right? We're saving a user to this in-memory test database. Then we're looking for that user. This is going to run a SQL query and get the results back and make sure that we get the results we expect.
Isn't that technically a true test?
Sorry?
Isn't that technically a true test?
This? Yeah, totally. And this is the way that I would do it now. But I remember when I was getting into this stuff and learning about it and reading on the internet about, you know, how unit tests should be fully isolated and they should never touch anything else. And you should just mock out the database access layer so that you never actually have to touch it in your tests. I would try and solve this in a different way, right? And the design that this would push me towards would be something like creating a user repository that takes like an instance of user that has access to like the database layer and mocking that out and saying, you know, mock the where method and say, you'd end up with something like this. I'll type it out. So you'd end up with like our test would be like, okay, so we're going to have like a repository. It's going to be like a new user repository. And it's going to take like maybe what people often call a gateway. And this gateway is going to be like a mock. And it's going to be a mock of like the user class in this case. And that gateway, should receive the where method with username as the first parameter and Jane Doe as the second parameter. And it should return a query builder instance, right? So we'll say that should return a query. Well, what's the query? Well, the query is going to be another mock. We'll just do an anonymous mock here. And that query should receive, first and return some known user. And known user is going to be a mock that we create up here. Mockery, mock, user class. And the known user will have a username matching the one that we expect. And then you would end up like, saying, okay, we create this user repository. We say user repository find by username. And then we implement that by just duplicating exactly what we typed here in the implementation. And that is not a good test. That doesn't actually test anything. All it tests is that you type the exact same string in 2 files. It doesn't actually test that you get the user back that matches the username. So an interesting observation that I would like to point out is this. So this is a graph that I put together the other day for this presentation. The x-axis is actual expertise that somebody has, and the y-axis is the expertise that they believe they have. Oh, projector going to ruin my joke. And there's this big section here, right, where someone doesn't actually have a lot of expertise, but they think that they know everything. And this is the area in someone's like journey through learning something where they act like an expert on the internet and tell you how to do things the right way and how you shouldn't be mocking the database and all this stuff. And if you talk to really experienced testers, they will all tell you that things that actually query the database need to be integration tested against the database. So when you see someone on the internet telling you the right way to do things, be critical of it and think about it yourself and come to your own conclusions. Because otherwise you might waste a lot of time writing a lot of bad tests that don't actually do a lot of good because people are telling you to do things in a certain way that I don't necessarily think is the way that experienced testers would actually do things. So getting back to our code here, where did we leave off? If we run this test, we get an error about not being able to find the factory. So that's a namespace thing again. So if we pull in the user and run the test again, hopefully we get a more useful error. No such table users. Okay, so this test also has to do the database migration stuff. So we'll use database migrations here too. Run this again. Call the undefined method find by username. Okay, great. So if we open up the user, we can actually create this find by username class or method now. It's gonna be a static function, find by username. Takes the username, run the test again before we actually implement it. Trying to get property of non-object, so it's complaining that found user is null because we're not returning anything. So now we can put the implementation that we actually expect to work here. So we're going to return something like self, where username, and just fetch the first one that matches. And if we run that, well, then you look, it will pass. So now that passes. And if we jump back to our acceptance test, to the viewing users tweets test, kind of jumping out another layer in that TDD loop that we were talking about before, and run this, that passes as well now. So we just TDD'd an entire feature for a brand new Laravel application that started with 0 code from scratch without ever opening the browser and implemented an actual feature end-to-end working against an actual database, completely test first. So I think that's pretty cool. I think to me, some of these ideas were like a real obstacle in getting better at this stuff, especially the whole like programming by wishful thinking thing and the idea of when you are working on these tests, instead of worrying too much about like trying to get the test to pass right away, like if you look at this loop that we were looking at before, right? When you first learn this stuff, you think, okay, you write a failing test, and then a lot of the literature will tell you make it pass as fast as possible, write the dirtiest code you can possibly think of to get the test to pass, and then refactor. That doesn't really work that well when you're doing outside-in TDD from the acceptance testing layer. And that took a long time for me to figure out, like trying to understand, like, when do I start driving out a unit test if I started with this outside-in TDD thing and I'm supposed to get the test passing as quickly as possible, then how am I supposed to ever end up with any unit tests or anything like that? And this idea of, instead of worrying about making the test pass right away, just worry about changing the error as often as possible, because that's like a sign of making progress. And a lot of the time, the way that you change that error is not necessarily by implementing something that actually works, but by writing code that you wish you had. And that's kind of like the design part of the TDD process, to me anyways. So if you're interested in more of this TDD stuff and testing stuff, I have a couple resources that I'd like to share that were really helpful for me. This Magic Tricks of Testing by Sandy Metz is a conference talk that she gave at a couple conferences. It is like the absolute best resource on understanding how to unit test different situations, and the idea of how you test a query versus a command and message direction. There's all sorts of interesting stuff in there. She puts together this awesome like chart that shows you exactly how you test different situations at the unit level, and it was really, really good. It kind of gets away from the whole classicist versus mockist or London versus Chicago TDD sort of thing, and just kind of looks at it from a fresh perspective of why you should use a mock here or why you shouldn't use a mock there. It's really, really good. Growing Object-Oriented Software Guided by Tests is a book that I talked about a little bit at the beginning. Those two guys, Nat Price and Steve Freeman, kind of introduced this idea of mock objects to the world, this idea of being able to make assertions that messages were sent versus making assertions about state or that things were, about the outcomes of different things. There's tons of really good stuff in that book about acceptance test-driven development and the whole walking skeleton thing. It's all in Java, so it's a little bit hard to kind of translate sometimes because it's not web-based. They're building like a desktop application, but it's still really good. RSpec book, I talked about that briefly as well. It's like an introduction to, you'd think it would be like how to use RSpec, but it's really like a book on behavior-driven development and using Cucumber and RSpec to do outside-in TDD and drive web applications. And the Cucumber book is a newer book. Cucumber is like an acceptance test writing language. Like, has anyone ever used Behat before, PHP? Cucumber is like what Behat is a port of, essentially. So there's lots of really good information about how to think about writing these tests and stuff in that book. So that's it. Check out my podcast, Full Stack Radio, if you're interested in this sort of thing. I interview lots of people that know lots more about this stuff than I do, and there's lots of really interesting conversations on there. And follow me on Twitter. I'm at Adam Wathan. I blog about stuff like this occasionally at my website, adamwathan.me. And if you could rate and review the talk at joinedin / that 5-digit number, that'd be great.